Okay, so first of all, I want to say thank you for watching this recording of a Drink Drug Hub training session. For people who don't know what it is, Drink Drug Hub is a website. You can see the address there at drinkdrughub.co.uk. It's a place where you can go to get all the right information about drink and drugs. So we've got web pages, guides, tools, videos to watch there, and also training sessions like this one today. You can attend them live, or as you're doing today, watch a recording. And this is module 1 of our drugs course. It's called Drugs Think Different. And the things we'll be going through really quickly in this session will be to look at common misconceptions about drugs, things you may have heard or been told about drugs that aren't true. We'll separate some myths from facts. We'll go through 5 realizations about drugs and prepare the way for future learning, should you want to do some more courses with us. But to begin with, we're going to start here. And this is actually the start of Drink Drug Hub as a resource. It was designed as a harm reduction resource, and harm reduction is a very specific way to work with people who use drugs, which is there are things you can do to reduce the harm of the drugs that you take. And there's a list of things down there on the right that apply to harm reduction interventions, things like safe injecting or having blood tests, advice about not using alone or wound care. So these are all things that we can look at to help reduce the harm of drugs. But actually, instead of starting here, which is where we were going to start the course, we thought there's a bit more to the story than this. And the whole story looks a bit more like this, that drugs are harmful, but then they are stigmatized. And the way they are stigmatized actually increases the harm further. So the stigmatization looks a bit like this. It's about the messaging you hear around drugs, that they're evil, instantly addictive, that they will ruin your life. And if they ruin your life, then we think there must be something wrong with someone who takes those drugs. And we label that wrong thing. So we talk about someone as an addict or lacking willpower, or we question their morality. And lastly, we use punishment as a deterrent. If this is a choice people are making, then we try and get them to make a different choice through punishing them. What we find is this increases harm to people who use drugs. And then we look at harm reduction. So those things that we can do to try and reduce the harm of the drugs that they take. And actually what we're questioning in this session is, why are we looking at harm reduction before looking at that stigmatization? This is where we need to look to begin with when we think about drugs. And when we look at stigmatization, what we're really talking about is this, harm. How harmful are drugs really? And this is really what it comes down to, and that's predominantly what we'll be looking at today. Now, what we do in the live session here is we do an exercise with people called good drug or bad drug. And this is about matching drugs to the reputations they've got. We've got 6 drugs listed down the bottom here: heroin, ecstasy, cocaine, cannabis, alcohol, and caffeine. And they all come with reputations. You can see those written above them there. Now, when we do this in a live session, we ask people to match the correct drug to the correct reputation in terms of how the public perceive those drugs. And you can see them for yourself there in terms of how they match up. Now, because this is a recording, we'll just skip through to how these actually match, which looks like this. So caffeine is a drug that makes us alert and work. Alcohol helps us relax, unwind and celebrate. Cannabis has a question mark next to it because we're quite mixed up about cannabis. Some people think it's the real force for good and some people think it's really evil, which we'll come back to. Ecstasy is a dance drug, cocaine's a high-class drug, and heroin's a drug that ruins your life. These are the kind of reputations these drugs have. And also, we've ranked these in terms of perceived harm, with the least harmful on the left, most harmful on the right in terms of how the public perceives this. Now, if you look at actual data around drug harms, you'll find it doesn't quite look like that. But this is how harm is perceived. What we do at this point, as I say, we do this with everyone who attends a live session. And what we predominantly find is this is how people match them together. They do get this right most of the time. So then we ask people this: how did they know that? How did they know, for instance, cocaine's a high-class drug or heroin's a drug that ruins their life? Now, unless they've actually tried those drugs themselves, and the vast majority of people do not take drugs, so they don't have that personal experience. What most people are using when they do this exercise is information that they themselves have been told about drugs. And that's really what they're repeating back to us in this session. And the story that they've been told, the things that they've heard, probably looks a bit like this. So heroin has been demonized, alcohol has been normalized, cocaine's been glamorized, and we've got examples of that as we go through here. Now, the first thing we're looking at here is the TV campaign in the 1980s. We're going to come back to that, called Heroin Screws You Up. Alcohol, you can go into any greetings card shop and you'll find loads of examples of how we've normalized alcohol use and turned it into humorous cards. And cocaine has been seen as a glamorous drug, as you can see here in a clip from Wolf on Wall Street. Matthew McConaughey plays a city worker. He's advocating very much that everyone who's rich and working in the city should have a go with cocaine. Now, the really interesting thing here is that those stories that we've been told, we kind of buy into them, but they are pretty unhelpful if we're trying to understand why people take drugs. And often this is the biggest barrier in terms of trying to support someone or trying to understand your own drug use. And an example of that would be Heroin Ruins Your Life, that campaign from the 1980s. So if this is the main thing that we understand about heroin, what we have to think about is how does it explain why someone would try it or why someone would keep using it. If it ruins your life, clearly you wouldn't try it and you definitely wouldn't keep using it. And yet people do. Now, the only way that we can really understand that, taking this as our basis of understanding heroin, is that these people must be mad in some way or they must be bad. And that means it's really difficult for us to understand that behaviour. And you'll find families and professionals getting quite frustrated at their lack of understanding. And that frustration often gets directed at the person directly, which becomes quite toxic for them. And the person themselves often feels this way when you talk to them. They don't understand this behaviour either, and they get frustrated. And actually what we find is this messaging really isn't helpful in terms of supporting them or helping them manage this behaviour. Now, what we do in the full session here is actually watch a video, which we can't play in a recording, but you can go and watch it at Drink Drug Hub. It's called What Causes Addiction, and it stars Johan Hari, who's an author who's written a book called Chasing the Scream. And in it, you'll learn about Rat Park and lots of other interesting bits of history in terms of how we understand drugs. But the main point he makes is drug addiction isn't actually really about the drug, but about the circumstances in which you live your life. That's the main way in which people will become addicted, because they don't have many other options or opportunities in life. But I'd recommend go and watch that whole video. But what you'll find is in the messaging around heroin, this isn't something that really comes across. The messaging is really about the drug itself and about how dangerous it is and how lethal it is. And as you can see in this campaign here, the Heroin Screws You Up campaign, that was a big part of it. It was aimed at school children and it used scare tactics to try and stop them trying heroin. Now you can see this for yourself. If you go to YouTube and write in Heroin Screws You Up, you can go and watch those TV commercials from the time. If it stars a girl, what you'll notice is they lose their looks very quickly over the course of the commercial and boys would lose control. But ultimately the message was very similar, that if you try heroin, your life will be ruined. So the idea was very much that this would stop people using heroin. And what we found was actually it didn't. It scared some people. Predominantly, it was children who were scared already, would then be petrified having watched the advert. But children who didn't have a pre-existing fear about heroin actually dismissed this advert and didn't think it was actually really applicable for them. And not without reason, because if you look at this, they would have reason to disbelieve some of the things these adverts were telling them. Because actually, when you look at heroin dependency rates, it's not that everyone who tries heroin becomes addicted to it. In fact, it's about 4 in every 10 people become dependent on heroin, which gives us this question about, well, why don't these people get addicted to this very potent drug? And it gets more interesting when you look at other drugs. So if you look at illicit drugs in general in the UK or in England and Wales, what you'll find is predominantly people don't get addicted to them. It's about 1 in 10 people develop addiction or dependency issues. The figure can be moved around a little bit depending where you get your data from. In this case here, we're getting our data from the British Crime Survey. And at the very minimum, what we can say is of the people who fill out those surveys, we know that 3 million people use drugs, but only just over 2 million of them are using their drugs less than once a month. The typical usage is not one of dependency. And actually addiction dependency happens to more of a minority of people using drugs. And there's a couple of other things to bear in mind around drug use. Now, again, what we have to say is that drug use isn't safe. So we have to be careful with how we go through this information. We're not suggesting it's safe or that people should use drugs. But this is what we know about drug use, that most people who use addictive drugs don't get addicted, and the same that most people who drink alcohol don't get addicted to alcohol. We know that drug use and experimentation with drugs is most common in younger age groups, and most young people will stop using drugs as they grow older. They'll grow out of this phase of their life. Now, for a minority, their drug use will have a serious and potentially lifelong consequence. They may even lose their life through their drug use. And the mistake that we make sometimes is we take this minority group of people and we take that to be the norm when it isn't. And we can see that with a couple of drugs in particular. So we've looked at heroin, but we'll also look at crack here and the messaging around that. Crack has got a reputation as being a super highly addictive drug, one of the worst in terms of addiction. And that reputation really came about in the 1980s, the late 1980s. And this guy was partly responsible for that. This is a DEA agent called Robert Stutman. He came to London from New York to give us a bit of a warning about crack. Now, crack did become a big thing in New York before it came to the UK, and it did become a real problem in certain parts of New York. Robert Stutman came across and he said, look, this is going to be really bad for the UK. It's about to hit the UK. And he talked about a study was about to be published showing that 75% of those who tried crack would be addicted after their third hit. The Sun picked that up with a headline called 3 Hits Gets You Hooked, and then it became part of official government literature, so the Home Affairs Committee started repeating the same statement. In fact, Douglas Hurd, the Home Secretary at the time, went to the Daily Mail and said crack was about to be the worst plague to hit Britain since the Black Death. So you can see this hyperinflation of risks and concerns around what crack would be and how it would affect us. Now, the really interesting thing is that journalists did some digging after this to find that original research that Robert Stutman talked about. And what they found was that it was never published. So actually this was based on nothing really in terms of research. Not to say there wasn't valid concerns there, but those concerns had been grossly misrepresented to the media and to the public. What you'll find though is these misconceptions live on today. So although this came around in the 1980s, we did some digging around and found this on a website in America. This is a recovery service in America, in Illinois. And they've got a page there called Facts About Crack. So this is where you would expect to find the most valuable and valid information about these drugs. So if you're struggling with crack, you go to them and look at their webpage to try and understand this drug better. And what you'll find is that they say that anyone using crack might become an addict in 2 or 3 weeks. And in some cases, people who try crack become instantly addicted the first time they use the drugs. This is even more another step beyond what Robert Stutman was saying. It says that if you try it just once, you'll be addicted potentially. Now, we know that's not true. Dr. Carl Hart is one of the world's leading experts around crack, and he says it's a claim so far from the truth it's ridiculous. There's no drug that produces addiction after only one use. Now, I understand why people are doing this. They're hyperinflating the risk to scare people so they won't try a drug that can be incredibly harmful. However, it starts to lose its credibility because it no longer actually rings true. And then we get to cannabis. Now, cannabis is a really interesting one in terms of how mixed up we are around the messaging. We don't even know in the UK really how to classify cannabis. At the moment, it's a Class B drug, which means you could face a maximum jail sentence for possession of up to 5 years. But previously, it was a Class C drug. In 2004, it had been downgraded to Class C. And then we moved it back to Class B again in 2009. As of 2022, we had 3 UK police and crime commissioners saying very vocally within the press that it should be a Class A drug, so ranked alongside heroin, crack, cocaine. I should say the government isn't entertaining that, but that's one of the discussions that's been going ahead. And at the same time as that's been happening in the UK, this same drug has been legalised in many countries around the world. So in Canada, in over half US states now, it's now legalised. Germany is going ahead with legalisation of it. In Thailand, it's decriminalised, but I think they're going back the other way with this now. But Singapore, which is very near Thailand, actually it carries a death sentence if you possess over 500 grams. So we're really mixed up about this drug depending on where you're on the world. Depends on whether you can buy it legally or whether you'll actually potentially face a death sentence for carrying a large quantity of it. In terms of how we got so mixed up about this drug, again, you can pull on this thread and take it back to its origin and say, well, where did this come from? How do we feel about cannabis and why do we feel about it the way that we do? And sooner or later, you'll come across this film. Again, I can't play the trailer, but you can find it online. It's called Reefer Madness. Put it on YouTube and you'll find the trailer. And this was really a public information film, portrayed as entertainment really, trying to portray the risks of cannabis to explain to people exactly what would happen if they tried cannabis. And it was a really simple story. It just said it makes you crazy. It starred this guy here, a guy I think he's referred to as Bill, very much seen as an upstanding citizen. He tried cannabis once and basically went out of his mind. We also had lots of different scenes in there of violence, debauchery, I think suicide is in there, lots of difficult things around cannabis. And the thing that they were trying to portray is that this is the norm, that anyone who tries cannabis, this is what will happen to them. Now, in terms of what was happening around that time, around that film and why the film was made, it takes us to this person. This is the last bit of history we've got here in terms of understanding where our stories come from around drugs. Now, this is Harry J. Anslinger. He was the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in 1930. He led a big campaign to demonize cannabis and get it banned and to go after groups of people who were using cannabis. He used racist stereotyping to do it, and he tried to gather as much evidence as he could to ban this drug and many other drugs besides it. When that evidence didn't materialize, he called it a gateway drug. The gateway drug, or the gateway theory, suggests that if you start with using cannabis, you will inevitably move on to much more potent drugs in time. You may be quite familiar with that. It's still a common theory today. However, I won't go through all the evidence here, but it's very much been challenged over those years, and there has been really not a lot of evidence to back it up. There is some, but there's also a lot of evidence to dismiss it, and we've got a bit of the details there on the slide at the moment. But it was looked at in the 1930s in America. The UK government looked at it in the 1960s and basically came to the same conclusion that there wasn't the evidence to say that most people who use cannabis will progress to harder drugs. And actually, what we now know is that that is true. Most people using cannabis don't graduate to harder drugs. They tend to stay with cannabis. Despite that, one of the current arguments to reclassify cannabis to a Class A drug in the UK is that it's a gateway drug. So this theory is still doing the rounds, even though there's not a huge amount of evidence for it. Which kind of takes us here in terms of, okay, what is the truth around drug harms and how do we better understand this? And this is where we're going to go through 5 quick realizations that will hopefully help anyone who works with or supports someone who uses drugs, or anyone who uses drugs themselves, to better understand what's actually happening when they take drugs and why they take drugs. So the first thing that we would recommend is that we kind of forget the stories that we're told around drugs. They aren't always very helpful, and often they're problematic. So our first realization is that it isn't really the drug that's good or bad. That's the critical thing in terms of what happens to someone who uses drugs. So this is how we see drugs. I say this isn't really very helpful in understanding this. There's not really a such thing as a good drug, a bad drug, a high-class drug, or whatever. Actually, drugs, when your brain takes a drug, your brain looks at them like this. And bear in mind, this is really important because these are psychoactive compounds. They're going to change the function of your brain. So your brain, the reason the functioning changes is because of these molecules. And that's really the most relevant thing about these drugs to your brain. It doesn't really care that alcohol's legal or heroin's illegal or cocaine has that reputation as a high-class molecule. These are just molecules that are going to change the function of the brain. So those storytelling or the stories that we are told around them aren't hugely relevant. It's just about what happens when you take them as the most relevant thing. Now, it is true that some drugs are more addictive than others, so we can say that. We know that with people who use cannabis, the dependency rate is about 1 in 10, and for people who use heroin, it's about 4 in 10. As a general rule, the more potent a drug and the faster acting it is, the more addictive it's likely to be. But it's not always that way. If you look at nicotine, the dependency rate is actually 6 in 10 for nicotine, higher than heroin. The next thing to think about is how do these molecules get into the brain and what happens next? So once you actually are going to administer a drug, you need to administer it in a particular way to get it across the blood-brain barrier. And from there, it can then affect the function of the brain. So people can inject drugs, drink them, sniff them, snort them, and different routes as well. These are really the most common routes that people will take drugs. And the main difference between this would generally be about how quickly the drug takes effect. If you inject the drug directly into the bloodstream, it will take effect very quickly, generally within 60 seconds. And if you eat or drink, it'll take longer because it has to go through your digestive system, so up to 20 minutes. But then you'll be feeling something different from the drug that you consumed. And in a really simplistic way, these are the kind of feelings you might have from these drugs. Heroin would make you feel numb, caffeine will make you feel alert, alcohol will help you feel relaxed, cannabis will help you feel chilled out, ecstasy will help you feel in love, and cocaine will help you feel euphoric. And you'll feel this way for between a couple of minutes to a couple of hours, depending on what the drug is and a couple of other factors besides. Now, the important thing is this, that if you take drugs, it's this experience that helps your brain decide whether this drug is a good or bad thing, not the story that you've been told around it, purely the feeling you get from it. And the other critical thing is, two people can have very different experiences of the same drug, even though the drugs are doing more or less the same thing. So we've hypothetically given two people heroin here. The person on the left is unlikely to enjoy this experience. They're going to find actually feeling numb and zonked out by the heroin is not going to help them in their day-to-day life. They have children to look after, probably a job to do here, commitments to fulfill. So they're not going to find this a helpful drug in their life, and then they're going to feel a bit sick of the come down. They're very unlikely to want to do that again. This isn't a feeling that's desirable or worthwhile for them to have. Person on the right, though, let's say they're struggling with psychological pain and trauma and have done for years and have struggled to get help through mental health services or the right medications, and they've really struggled with their life in general. And then they take this drug and feel this instant relief and they're numbed out from it. They're very likely to want to repeat that experience. Their brain is very likely to log that as a good thing to be doing. So this isn't about willpower. It is about choice, but it's also about the factors behind your choice and why you make that choice. It doesn't mean someone's right and someone's wrong. It's just trying to understand why they make their choices. There's a lot of reasons why the person on the right might want to take that drug again that would help us understand why they're doing it. And that takes us to the second realization. The addiction is not just about the drug. You can give the same drug to lots of different people. They'll have different experiences based on lots of different factors. And a lot of those factors is about their own lives. So this is really about the person taking the drug. It's really the critical thing around whether they develop an addiction or not. Now, like I say, there are lots of theories about one person would become addicted and not others. And some of these lack evidence completely. The idea of willpower, that they just can't say no. There's no evidence to say that this is the case. Instead, we would probably encourage you at this point, or we would encourage you at this point, to look at the work of Gabor Mate. He's a world-renowned addiction specialist, and his take on this is very much that a common theme for people who develop addiction issues is trauma, that they've had traumatic life experiences, and that their drugs are helping them cope with that in some way. Now, he isn't saying that everyone who experiences trauma will develop addiction issues. He just says there's a high correlation there. And actually, if we understand this person as having experienced trauma, and that's the core issue, it's likely actually we'll be able to understand the core issue much better than thinking it's just the fact that they're choosing to take drugs. Now we need to think about our third realization here. What we've talked about so far is about addiction. The idea that if you take a drug, you can get addicted, lose control of it, and end up being unable to stop that habit. Now, addiction risk actually, as we've seen here, works out about 1 in 10 over a big population sample. But a key point here is that it's different from person to person. So we shouldn't suggest that everyone has a low addiction of risk and therefore should feel more comfortable taking drugs. You should absolutely have a good think about what your own risk might be when you're taking any drugs, and if taking drugs is a wise idea for you. But when you take it over a big population sample, the risk of addiction is quite low. It's about 1 in 10. But then you can compare that to other risks that come with taking drugs, and what you'll find is actually there is no risk-free way to take illegal drugs. There's always a risk to everyone who's consuming these drugs. You might not have a high risk of addiction, but there is still risks of overdoses, accidents, risk to your cardiac health, particularly if you're taking stimulants like cocaine, bloodborne viruses, infections, and mood disorders. There's lots of things to think about if you're going to be taking drugs, and lots of risks that you need to be mindful of. Not the only reason, but maybe the main reason for this is this, that the information you're given with your drugs is very limited. Now, if you go and get over-the-counter medications and drugs, things like paracetamol, you will get an information leaflet with it. By law, it has to be there. The pharmaceutical firm has to produce this, and it will tell you about the dosage. It will tell you about how it interacts with the drugs. It will tell you lots of useful things that you should know if you're going to take paracetamol. But if you take a more potent drug like cocaine, you have to go to the illegal market, and the illegal market doesn't give you leaflets like that. This is how you buy your cocaine on the illegal market. It comes in a little bag like this and no information. And it's very much down to you to work out things like your dosage, how to administer it, what the effect should be, how long it should last, what other contaminants might be in there, or what the come down looks like. In other words, you're very much taking this drug blind. And that gets us to the most tragic slide in this training session, which is this. These are images of young people who have all died having consumed drugs. Now, this is an article about Louise on the left. The way that she died tragically was she took ketamine and then she went out of the bath and she drowned in the bath. Other young people pictured here died in similar ways and similar circumstances. There was nothing to suggest they were struggling with dependency or addiction, and if their lives had worked out in the way that many lives of young people work out, this would have been a phase they were going through, experimenting with drugs in the same way young people experiment with lots of things and then growing out of this. Now, they never had the opportunity because of tragically losing their lives having taken those drugs. And what we know is that actually drug poisonings in the UK have been rising year on year for many years now. In fact, since producing this, we've now got the latest data for drug poisoning in the UK, and we are now over 5,000 people a year dying in this way. So that's 3 times the number of people who die on UK roads. It's a really big factor in terms of how many people are dying in the UK at the moment. But you might not have heard a huge amount of outrage about it or public outcry. And this takes us here to the 4th realisation. Why aren't we more outraged about people suffering harm having taken drugs? And if we're frank, it's because there's an attitude that potentially maybe people deserve it if they do something like this, that they're inflicting harm on themselves. And this takes us into this moral dimension about how do we judge someone who uses drugs. And we know there are moral judgments about people who take drugs. And that means there's maybe less incentive to help them or support them or protect them from harms. In fact, in some cases, we know that historically harms have been seen as a good thing, as a way of deterring people from using drugs. There's a quote here, I won't read it all out, but from the 1980s, this was a particular thing that was happening in America. And a writer called Maya Salvitz has written extensively about this, that this was a real issue. But we can bring it to more modern days and also to the UK by taking a look at this example here. This was from 2009 in the UK. It's a slogan that went up on buses around London called Nice People Take Drugs. Now, it was put there by the legal charity Release, who want to campaign against the stigmatisation of people who use drugs. And they're making a point that nice people also take drugs. And this is true, depending on how we term nice. We know that nice people take drugs. However, they were forced to remove this advert because the regulator felt it would provoke complaints. It contradicted what we understood about drugs and people who take drugs. We understand them to be bad people is ultimately what this suggests. You can't say that nice people take drugs. And yet, like I say, we know that nice people take drugs. We've got examples here of Stephen Fry, Davina McCall, Ed Sheeran, who all have wholesome reputations in the public media, and yet they've all struggled with drug use. So our understanding about who takes drugs, and why they take drugs, sometimes different to what the reality is. And we can also see that in terms of the use of Class A drugs, often this is believed to be in a subclass of people in society. But actually Class A drug use is more common in households where there's a lot of money than in households where there's less money. The most common drug in poorer households is actually cannabis. So maybe what we think we know about drugs isn't necessarily true. This is really important if we're going to try and support people who use drugs or if we ourselves use drugs. That takes us to that 5th realisation, that the better we understand this issue, the better we can provide support and the less harm will come to people who use drugs, and the more likely they are also, by the way, to make decisions to stop taking drugs in time. So hopefully we've challenged this in this session today, the stigmatisation of drugs. And as we come to the end, this is where hopefully we've reached, that the understanding that drugs themselves are not evil. They can be highly addictive, but this is only true for some people. For those people, their addiction should not be seen as a sign of weakness, but a sign that they need help. And when we're thinking about drugs, we need to think of other risks besides addiction and to have other conversations besides addiction as well. So although no drug use is safe, there's always steps people can take to reduce harm. And if you'd like to understand those steps better and how to reduce harm, then we do have other sessions available for you to attend. I will skip through this last bit and just finish with this slide here. You can keep learning at Drink Drug Hub. Come to the website at drinkdrughub.co.uk to book a live session or watch another recording available on this platform. Thank you.